The far right, billionaire wealth continues to increase, as does the grip of authoritarianism. There is a sense that their current economic system just isn't working. A new economy, however, might just be emerging, cooking away in the background. So today's guests will take us through what exactly the new economy is all about and how it will reshape us and how we can reshape that. Today we have Jo Swinson. She is Director of Partners for a New Economy, an international philanthropic fund since 2020. Jo's previous life in frontline politics has seen her be UK government minister, leader of the Liberal Democrats, and a member of parliament. In 2009, Jo co-founded a cross-party group of MPs to work collaboratively on new economy thinking and well-being economics. We also have Chris Monahan, founding partner of Metabolic and the director of Metabolic Ventures. In his work, Chris focuses on building not-for-profit organizations that fill critical gaps and address systematic challenges. This involves building incubators and venture studios, engaging with steward finance models, and supporting existing nonprofits. Before we get to the latest research, Jo, I kind of want to start with you because you've been at the heart of Partner for New Economy's attempts to facilitate the new economy. And we often talk about new, yet it appears that so many of those values come from older traditions, maybe even ancient wisdom. Could you just remind us what the economy principles are, where they come from, and why it matters?
I think thanks very much, Shafi. And I think it's a really interesting question because often we think about the economy and we imagine it as fixed, that there's just like these rules, like that's the way it is. And we can forget that our economy has changed so many times. Like even within the 20th century, there was a massive change in the 1940s, post-war, when Keynesian came in. And then actually in the 1980s when neoliberalism was on the rise. So we look at it and we think that's how it is. It's changed before. And of course, there's lots of places where there is wisdom about a different way of thinking about economics. And when it's not working, which, as you say, it clearly is not for people's lives, which they feel like they're getting worse, for the planet, where we're crashing through 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, creating a toxic inheritance for our children and grandchildren. Not only, should we change our economics? We can change our economics because it is something which is created by people and it has been different before. And of course, there's many places in the world where it is currently and still thought of differently. Some of the grant making that we've done in the past is in New Zealand, where the Maori wisdom is a really important part of how they think about 7 generations, how they think about themselves as embedded within nature. So if I was to think of some of the principles that are important about new economics, which will nonetheless look different in different places, but some of those principles, one is about being regenerative rather than extractive, right? So that sort of common sense saying, you should leave the world a better place than you find it. And if you apply that to economics, that just basically means that, you have your economic activity, but that should be something which is kind of net positive to the world. And the problem at the moment is that because our systems just ignore so many of the real costs of economic activity, whether that's social cost or whether that's ecological cost, we can find that economic activity, you celebrate the graphs going up in the right direction, but you've actually depleted your natural capital. You've actually created huge amounts of human suffering. And so the net value might actually be negative. So it needs to be regenerative, not extractive. There's also a sort of principle around interdependence. So again, the kind of neoclassical economics kind of sees us all as atomized individuals. And if you just each individually optimize your own utility, that will add up to the best good possible. And that's how it works. It makes no kind of nod to how our lives are interconnected with each other and indeed with the living planet. And we saw in the pandemic, for example, public health is a great example of this. You cannot just do it on your own. If you want to have good health, that relies on the health of the society in which you live. And that's true for so many different issues. So we need to recognize that interdependence rather than just thinking everything is about the individual. And then the third principle, and I mean, there are many more, but I'll just stick with these three. The third principle is about what timeline you're looking at. So I think in new economics, you need to be looking at the long term as well as the short term. So obviously, things matter in the here and now. But at the moment, our current economics puts far too much focus on the here and now and far too little focus on the future. And the way that the economic kind of way that is done is through the discount rate. So it literally discounts the future and assumes that the future is less valuable. And that's why climate action is perceived to be very expensive, even though on a common sense level, it's a no-brainer to make investments that are going to get us fit for the future and save us not just money, but save lives, you know, from now and increasingly over many years to come. So regenerative, interdependent, and taking a long-term view of success, I think would be three key principles. And the thing is, it really can happen, right? Like we can change the economy. It's totally possible.
There's so much to unpack, and we'll do that later on, and particularly on collective well-being, metrics, the scars of COVID. There is so much to unpack, and we'll definitely get there. Chris, Metabolic recently published a report mapping the terrain of the new economy in Europe. Um, and there are many organizations who are experimenting, adopting, or embodying these principles that Joe's talking about. So, in the style of a kind of methodical Indiana Jones, I want you to take us through this new terrain, showing us where they are and what they do.
Okay, well, Indiana Jones is a tall order, but I'll try to make it as exciting. It's really great to be here. I'm going to quickly share some slides. I promised to keep them short, but I think it's not clear where everyone's at in terms of whether you're new to the space or if you've read the report or not. So I'm just going to run through some general insights from the report and then kind of go into a broader conversation. So first, I want to say that this project was a real honor, and it was a labor of love from our team. And it was intense and difficult, but I think it was really exciting to do this work. Briefly, why we did this work. I think this follows from the Demos Helsinki's undertaking of the first mapping in 2022. And there was just a clear need to uncover and understand the kind of latest and greatest of Europe's new economy ecosystem, given how fast it's expanding and changing. The second reason is that we see a hunger for alternatives that is kind of growing in intensity and kind of really entering the mainstream. So you see that from rising cost of living, you see that with the growing financialization of the economic system, you can spot it in the kind of strengthening of the far right. There is this need for alternative approaches to economics that are also kind of combating the tipping points that we're crossing in terms of climate and biodiversity. So there is this true need that is kind of moving beyond the fringes. And that this crisis is a necessary opportunity. I mean, there is a lot to despair about and a lot to be concerned about, but I think we need to really kind of embrace this set of crises, some call it a polycrisis, to really move the needle significantly and make radical changes. And then finally, I think maybe even most importantly, there is this upstream nature of economic systems change where, you know, there are people doing really good work on climate change and biodiversity loss and poverty and all sorts of issues. But I think increasingly there's this sense that these are more symptoms from the root cause of the way our economy functions. And I think kind of bringing people more into that fold and helping to increase that realization, I think can really help all these issues that so many organizations and individuals care about. So we mapped a very much an expanding field. We looked at and found 735 organizations across 35 countries. There's a lot people read into this map. I think it's good to state a few things. United Kingdom, you see, is this kind of dark blue, and it has a lot of organizations. I think two reasons for that is that there has been kind of an engagement or kind of suffering under neoliberal economics for much longer than most other parts of Europe. And there's historically been more wealth kind of flowing into philanthropies in the United Kingdom, and so that there's more resources for this kind of work. In Eastern Europe, you see a much kind of smaller ecosystem that is mostly new and emerging. Part of that is just the hangover, I think, of the authoritarian rule from USSR, where capitalism still seems relatively good, and that there is just, you know, kind of a little bit of an allergy to even concepts like worker cooperatives and stuff like this because of that experience. When you look at per capita, you know, in terms of how many organizations compared to the population of countries, the map looks a bit different. But in either case, there is really this kind of growing field, and a relatively new field. We see that it really has been very responsive to crises. So there's a lot of organizations that have been founded after the Great Recession in 2008, and recently with the inflationary pressures and the kind of feeling that, you know, climate is spinning out of control. There are these kind of real issues that we need to respond to. And so you see that resurgence or the surge of organizations being founded in response to that. I think this is not the way we mapped these organizations was pretty systematic as best as we could. So we built upon existing landscape studies. We did searches, both manual and AI-driven searches in every European language. And we kind of fit that to a kind of clear set of inclusion criteria. An organization had to be not-for-profit or nonprofit. It had to have kind of an explicit mission for economic systems change. And so, you know, this is not a complete census of the field. I think it's impossible to really do that in 100% way, but I do think it is robust enough to really show that there is a thriving and young and increasingly diverse movement of organizations out there. One of our roles and tasks in this work was to really categorize the field. People across the field told us that they don't need to be put into some kind of neat little box. And they, you know, that's not really the purpose of this. It was really to create a sense of pluralism and shared language, and to kind of show the diversity of the field and what is kind of considered as part of the field. So I think what we saw a lot is that people really embraced and proactively talked about this kind of tapestry of organizations being important, that you need the people working in Brussels on policy and influence, but you need the energy cooperatives in Greece, and you need everyone in between. So I think this is an activity-based typology that really shows what organizations do. And I think organizations are likely to work on more than one thing here and work across multiple activities. And there's a second typology. Oh, before we get there, you can kind of see the typology come alive a little bit with different organizations. Economic Change Unit is really working on movement building and organizing. Finance Watch is really doing great work on policy advocacy. You have Purpose, I think they're even here, doing incredible stuff around steward ownership. Community Arts Network is working on arts and cultural action connected to economic systems change. Stichting Doen in the Netherlands is a really interesting funder that offers catalytic capital of different sorts. And Rethinking Economics is doing really interesting work on curriculum change. So I think, and all of these organizations, I would say, would probably consider themselves working across multiple activities. And then you also have a theme-based typology, which is really about, like, what are the themes that organizations work on? What are the systems that organizations work on? Everything from kind of socioeconomic security and justice to sectoral system transformation, kind of reinventing how we provide energy and water and treat our food systems and land, et cetera. So there's kind of growing kind of tapestry of kind of topics that we see evolving over time as the field really changes and shifts what it considers to be really important part of this field. And here you also can kind of see this typology come alive. Transcap is doing really cool work with transformative capital. CODA in Switzerland is doing great things with real kind of large scale affordable housing. Versorgen in Austria is doing good stuff with care work and rethinking about how the care economy works. So there's just a lot of incredible organizations. I hope you can take a look at all of them in the report, and we'll get to in a bit this kind of index that we're creating where everything will be searchable and we can kind of find all these organizations and what they're doing. But it really is this kind of rich tapestry. And beyond these two typologies, to really help people find each other, we've kind of offered a set of tools and categorization mechanisms where you can say, these are the type of stakeholders I work with. This is how close I am to implementation. This is how close I am to influencing power. And this is how close I am to policymaking. And these are the kind of geographic scales of action that I work in. And it's not meant to put people into boxes, but it's meant to kind of give people this language of saying, well, you know, we both work in housing. You work with policy, I work with implementation. Maybe by working together, we can really change the way housing works in this region or this country. So there's 10 key findings. I'll only talk about 4. So, you know, in the executive summary, you have these kind of 10 key findings listed out, and the report just goes into a lot of detail, and I do recommend it if you haven't read it. One finding is that funding is the binding constraint. I think there's a chronic lack of funding for the new economy field. And I think that's true, broadly speaking, in kind of any field involving arts, culture, social change, economic, like environmental change. But I think for this field, it's particularly acute. We talked to a lot of organizations that said they really spend a ton of their time just chasing funding, small amounts, kind of 2-year time horizons and stuff like that. I'm sure that's familiar to many of you. I think one of the issues is the legibility of some of this work to kind of traditional funders. You know, the long horizon and the kind of sometimes abstract nature of systems change is just kind of resistant to typical metrics. And sometimes there's a lack of constituency. Like there's a lot of natural constituency in maybe political parties that value some of this kind of work, but it can't get political. And often those political parties have their own kind of think tanks and policy shops, et cetera. So the constituency is us, the people, and the kind of society at large, but it just, I think that's something worth keeping in mind. But on the other hand, there's a huge potential to kind of increase funding for this field, and philanthropy, despite its limitations, is one of the few places where you can kind of identify and find risk patient capital that can really do a lot to fund the objectives of this growing field. So I think that can have a huge potential that we should try to unlock. Finding number 7, what we heard a lot from the field is that there is this risk of this kind of Brussels technocracy bubble, that it certainly isn't true for every organization or maybe even a majority of the field, but based on the kind of some of the jargon and language that is used and some of the kind of very much focus on like specific policy outcomes, there is this risk of being detached, so that we need solutions for common problems as much as possible. So where possible, we should be focusing on rising cost of living, stagnating wages, the influence that wealth has on the political process. And I think that's really key for making sure that at least the most of the actions that this field takes is really addressing what people feel in their everyday lives. And I think most people by now will be aware of Mamdani, who just won the New York City mayor election. And I think that is a good example. He's a good example of how he has translated that to everyday problems. Finding number 8, there is a clear missing middle. I don't know if it's as scary of not having anything between 2 burger buns, but it felt like the right image to use. I think you can kind of picture this in 2 main ways. One is this gap between the policy kind of level, let's say that top bun, and the grassroots, the bottom bun. So there's just very little or minimal ligamentation between these 2 places. And policy needs to learn from grassroots experiments and grassroots experiments, whether it's community land trusts in certain areas or cooperative energy systems or anything, they need help with common barriers that you can really only get from policy. So I think organizations or individuals or leaders who can really bring these two groups together and create more of a dialogue is really important. And I think the other way to think about this missing middle is this kind of gap of replicating and scaling what works. If we pick on the community land trust, I think it's a really interesting model, but there's a few of them, you know, like the European Community Land Trust Network, I think has documented most of them, but in Belgium, there's like a handful. And I think we need thousands. And I think it's about organizations who can kind of pick up some of these types of models that are basically manifesting new economic principles and practice and find out how to orchestrate the capital and simplify the governance and really scale them or replicate them in a kind of at the level that's necessary. Finally, there is the kind of issue of politics, which we didn't go too much into in the report. It's the big elephant in the room, I think. It is a really important issue. There is often a kind of tension between, do we get political and do we even run for office, or do we kind of stay neutral and try to kind of influence policymakers in some way or kind of build coalitions around issues? And I think the conclusion that we've come to and has been fairly validated by the field is that it needs to be both. It needs a dual track approach. And I think that's in terms of the field, not in terms of an organization. I think an organization will often have to choose how it engages in politics and go one way or the other. But for the field, we need to not be seeing policymakers as someone else. We need to be building governing power. We need to be launching modern political parties when necessary. We need to be getting into the ring and kind of taking all the challenges of governing and trying to make this stuff work. And we also need, you know, issue-based, nonpartisan organizations that are really laser focused on a couple of issues like affordability, wealth taxes, digital sovereignty, whatever it is. And I think in the States, you see some good examples of this. You have kind of on the political side, you have the kind of Democratic Socialists of America on the left, and then the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society on the right that are really trying to say, look, we're going to get in the ring and we want to influence the political process. We want to influence politics. And on the issue-based nonpartisan side, you have the ACLU, which focuses on civil liberties and free speech, and the American Enterprise Institute, which focuses on kind of, you know, free markets and this kind of thing. And these organizations on the bottom are willing to work with anyone who kind of agrees with them on that issue. So just some quick closing thoughts. This is really a rapidly evolving field. There are so many new organizations being founded. We actually had to like decide consciously to stop collecting organizations so that we can kind of finish the work and really do the analysis. And I already see some kind of regional deep dives happening to really understand kind of more colorful sense of the regional ecosystems. So I think those are really important. And I hope the kind of typologies and other tools that we've offered in this work can be really evolved as things evolve. And then finally, part of this work was really to create a living directory so that organizations can search for other organizations, find like-minded or kind of synergistic partners, and be found by funders who are interested in maybe an aspect of this work and are looking for organizations focused on housing or food or finance policy or whatever the case may be. So that can be found at neweconomyindex.eu. It's currently in beta. We're going to be improving some things over time with feedback and kind of launch the official version in January, but it's live now. And I think what's good to note, whether you have been mapped already by us or that you consider yourself part of the new economy and want to add yourself, it's really important that you update your information so that we can really understand what you're doing by activity, theme, what stakeholders you're working with, which is really what's going to make that useful. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Wow. And that was the short version, by the way. There is so much more to unpack. I'm going to work backwards, actually, and I'm going to start from where you started, Chris, at the beginning, and just looking at the geography of it all. When I was looking at it, I just found it incredibly significant and even hopeful and exciting that there's such a high number of new economy organizations from the very countries and places that birthed colonialism and empire. And you've touched on it already, Chris. You've kind of mentioned it already, but are there other reasons as to why Western Europe appears to have a higher number of new economy organizations? And can you explain maybe some of the disparities in Southern Europe?
Yeah, it's a good one. I think um, it's a little bit conjecture, to be honest. I think in Southern Europe, I do know that there's a lot more new economy stuff, happening in practice than we were able to map just on the basis of our criteria. So in Spain, you have a huge cooperative movement, but not every cooperative is in our mapping and directory because the criteria was that they were kind of explicitly focused on economic systems change. And there are a lot of organizations like that that are just living these values and living these principles, but are not necessarily talking about them in the same way. And that's a little bit of a limitation of our work, but it would have been very difficult to kind of add every organization that was like that. So there's probably more that's going on than meets the eye. And I think, in wealthier economies, and I think there is this kind of sense that it is time for a post-growth mentality, that, there is not the need to keep growing, and that organizations and people there are realizing the deep cost of growth, whereas kind of countries that arguably still need quite a bit of economic development and infrastructure, et cetera, that kind of concept seems a bit further away. So that would be my assumption.
Yeah, and Joe, you've seen this for a long time now. You've been on the ground, particularly in the UK. I'm intrigued to know kind of as to your perspective of why the UK in particular and its neighbours appear to be much more forward in the new economy.
I think I agree with the reasons that Chris has suggested that might be partly behind that. And I mean, we're also undertaking a funder mapping, which is going to be published in the new year, separate to this, to kind of go alongside this report. And the researchers on that have also found this pattern, unsurprisingly, but they've also said it's a similar pattern to when you look at the environmental grants and so on. So I think this is partly about, like, where is their money? The UK has a lot of think tanks compared to some other countries. And that would be, think tanks that were absolutely opposite to this agenda. But if you just have a lot more research, policy, campaigning organizations, and these things being funded, then that also means you will have more in a new economy type area as well. But the other element I wanted to flag really is I think there's a clustering effect as well. So next year the New Economics Foundation celebrates its 40th anniversary. That's 1986 it was founded. I mean, I remember joining up to them in the 1990s, and it was certainly very influential in my thinking, and so many other people I know that will be the case for as well. And I can think of organizations in the UK, New Economy Organisers Network literally incubated within NEF and then spun out, and there's many others. And lots of people who are working at other organisations in the New Economy who had a stint at NEF as well. So I think when you have some strong anchor organisations, you get that clustering. Similarly, if you look at France, there's a real kind of exciting set of particularly academic work that is happening. So you've got Piketty, you've got Timothée Paric, you've got Zuckman, so you get, I think people get energy and support from one another and inspiration. And obviously these are factors that often get ignored by our kind of very rational models of the way things work, but we all know as human beings that of course this has a huge impact. So I think clustering is part of it, and that's why actually also as a funder you can say, well, if you see a gap, then that's where putting in money also can have a really outsized impact, because if you fund some organizations, you're also potentially creating a kind of magnet or a node that will actually seed much more to happen as well.
Yeah, and there are challenges, particularly you talk about funding, there are challenges for philanthropy happening right now. And the challenge is to meet this opportunity of bringing the transition about. And I know Partner for a New Economy's latest funder mapping, I think showed about 330 funders across Europe were engaged in new economy work. But around 60, 70 were making consistent contributions. Would it be right to say it feels like funding is still kind of thinly spread
Yeah.
for a systems level change? And I'm thinking maybe current philanthropy is just constrained by its own values.
Well, I think so. There's a couple of things I would unpack there. So, I mean, I think the first thing to say, I mean, I vividly remember finding out that Partners for a New Economy existed, and that was in early 2020. For well understood reasons, I was looking for a new challenge in early 2020. What was I going to put my energy into? And I met up with the wonderful Catherine Trebek, who I'd known for many years, and we'd worked together on wellbeing economy stuff when I had been an MP. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I'd really like this agenda to be, part of it. But I was also like, to be honest, it'll probably have to be in a voluntary capacity. I'll probably have to, have a full-time job doing something else, because it didn't really feel like a field that had a lot of paid roles available. Anyway, she was explaining this project she was working on, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And I was like, where's the funding coming from? And she mentioned this organization, Partners for New Economy. So I went and looked it up, and we're a group of donors funding economic systems change. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And actually 2 months later, they were recruiting for a director. And I was like, this is the perfect timing, perfect opportunity. But I remember being like so pleasantly surprised and shocked that there were philanthropy organizations that were prepared to fund this kind of stuff. So I think the first thing to kind of recognize is like it is a bit counterintuitive, but it is progress, and it is positive. And I think it was very forward thinking of those foundations that came together to set up P4NE back in 2015. Under the founding director Leslie Haroon. I think that is really notable. But also, like, that number of, I was shocked when we looked at the organizations we'd funded and who else had funded them. Because when we asked people to, submit a grant application, say, who else is funding you? So we had some of that information, and the breadth was like, there's so many different organizations that are in some way, shape, or form funding new economics. But that's also, I think, a testament to the breadth of the field, because there's lots of those funders wouldn't consider themselves to be funding the new economy, right? They would be funding something that was mainly because they were funding climate, and this was a kind of interesting research report or campaign on climate, but happen to have a new economy lens. And so I think there's a challenge in that, in terms of these aren't necessarily committed new economy funders, but there's also an opportunity to help funders understand those intersections between the work that they're funding. They're focused on health, actually the economic determinants of health, whether that's what pharmaceutical companies are doing, or what the public health systems are, and how that is funded within a country's economy. There's a lot of those crossovers. And then that final point, really, like, philanthropy is a product of the current economic system, right? So let's just say it. There is a challenge there, right? It is a tension. It can be difficult. And all philanthropic money effectively comes from that economy, and the problematic elements of the economy that we see in the crises around us. And I think that can create a fear of judgment, or a kind of accusation of hypocrisy for funders that then get involved. That said, for those that do, I mean, I think generally, like, people within the field have a very pragmatic approach, right? It's like, okay, so money has been created, lots of stuff has happened, but how can that wealth then be used to try to create a more positive future? I mean, that's really what the interesting element of this is. And I do see that more funders are prepared to look more broadly and want to not just do something that is neat and that ticks a box and that's makes them kind of feel good, but actually is really trying to grapple with a difficult problem, even if it is a bit messy and it is hard, and it's not something which in 2 years' time you're going to feel is entirely solved. But I think it's ultimately more satisfying to feel that you're actually trying to go to the heart of where the problem is.
Yeah, and it's not about just, we're talking about money and financing, but a large part of that is redistributing power. Um, and Chris, within the report, I'm really intrigued to know, on this redistribution of power, how are you assessing that, and how did you identify that, and what is the trends for that within funding?
Yeah, it's a good one. I think the organizations and funders that are increasingly funding the new economy field are also much more progressive in how they think about what they're funding and how they're funding. So I think there is more appetite, even though it's slow to build, in more structural funding, less kind of arduous reporting, and more kind of trust-based relationships with people that are really leading this work for longer time horizon. So I think that's really positive. I also think that there are some experiments that seem to show some good success around community wealth building, around participatory grant making, around thinking about the role of just regranters in general that are closer to the kind of ecosystem of organizations that they're meant to serve. So I think all those things are quite positive. Sometimes these things work fast or slow. So I think, sometimes it's slow to have a kind of broader uptake, but those have been really successful experiments and initiatives. And I think it's just about building on that and making sure that the way we fund is also, working on these kinds of, field builders, connectors that are really kind of bringing together people from different areas so that the kind of the city worker and the kind of climate justice campaigner and the union organizer can really kind of find a way to each other and kind of finding these kind of unlikely allies. And some of that stuff is really kind of abstract work in a way, kind of weaving together a field and really connecting different people. But that is also kind of democratizing a little bit that the field itself and trying to kind of bring people together under one shared set of principles. Yeah.
Just a reminder to our audience, if you have questions, do pop them in the Slido box at the bottom and we will get to those soon. Chris, as you were talking, I just had the words pop up: coalition. It's a word that I've been having in my head for quite a while now. And I was so chuffed to see you put Mamdani in your presentation. Very topical. I don't know about you guys, but I'm still hanging on to the coattails of what was remarkably joyful and moral articulation of new economy principles within a city. He speaks in a very politically inventive way to different audiences, but his message is always the same. The current system no longer serves the majority, and it's time to deliver basic needs in the name of care and justice. Joe, I'm wondering, how do we go about building these diverse coalitions within the new economy? Because it is incredibly messy.
Yeah, it is. And I think also it's worth naming that particularly in progressive circles, right, that there's a real skill set of managing to disagree over the smallest thing and like fall out massively and spectacularly. So, that's clearly going to be counterproductive. And I think particularly for this agenda, because I mean, I don't know about others on the call who might be, engaged in new economic thinking, but maybe just speaking for myself, I feel, obviously, having worked in this now really full time for the last 5 years, I feel like I understand so much more about it than when I started, even though I've been interested in writing and reading about this since like 2006. And so I feel like my own understanding has been on a massive journey. And I kind of think that's going to be true for everybody, right? So some of the concepts that might feel incredibly challenging when you first meet them, like, assumptions that we have about how do you tackle poverty, or what does a growing economy mean, and what's good about that, and what does that look like, there are, even the word capitalism. I mean, I note that, like, Kate Rayworth doesn't like to mention the word capitalism because, as she says, and she's right, you get into a fight immediately with people because people have a very strong predetermined view about it. So I think we also just need to understand that if we want to take people with us, which is essential because the number of people that currently believe that the economy needs to fundamentally change is probably not sufficient, right? We need to be able to encourage more people to kind of get on board with that view and the extent of transformation to something better. we need to allow space for people to kind of come on board with part of it and then like discover more. So when we do our annual gathering, you know, we have a real mix of approaches, of kind of levels of, you know, we often talk about the 3 horizon framework. So, you know, horizon 2 is kind of like, how do we incrementally get to a better future, and horizon 3 is like real blue sky thinking. And you kind of, what you need, I think you need both these things. You need the people that are going to work with, you know, the messy corridors of power right now and say, okay, this is the thing we can win now, that we can change now and make sure it's in the right direction. But you also need the people who are ideating and thinking about how this can be fundamentally different, and you need some meeting between the two of them. So I think we need space for that journey, and I think we need broad coalitions of, with a recognition that people will disagree on some of the details and on some of the approaches, but it's not about like one single theory of change. It's not about one single organization or type of organization. It has to be a broad movement that is loosely connected and going in the same direction, but with slightly different paths and in slightly different ways. And I think there are inspiring examples where you've seen that land, particularly the simplicity with which Mandami was able to articulate it. And you know what he was talking about, some other people would describe as sufficiency, right? Like, you know, what do we have as our basic needs, which frankly sounds much less attractive in that framing than how he was able to put it forward in a very resonant way. So, I mean, those communicators who are able to really break through with it is another really important part of what we need.
Yeah, and in the report, I found a really interesting phrase called building connective tissue. I really liked that. It's so visual. And I'm wondering, and this is a question for both of you. I'll start with Chris. There are some unlikely alliances forming, right, in this new economy. I'm thinking maybe religious organizations, for example. Could you kind of outline where those alliances are forming already?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is a kind of broad belief that everyone is really welcome if they're following these kinds of principles. So I do think that there is a group within the field that I find, you know, kind of, let's say, the nonpartisan group that really appreciates the voices of kind of conservative institutions that are aligned with key principles of the new economy, or center-right economists that are really focused on what does real competitive markets look like and need. And it's not necessarily what it looks like today. So there is a lot of interesting voices from across the spectrum that I think, when it gets to these kind of specific issues that, you know, the new economy big tent cares about, there is a lot of room for collaboration. And religious institutions are a good example. I mean, there is a lot of not all religious institutions are created the same, but there is a lot of community focus and a lot of care for people and the poor, and in service of communities. And I think that is extremely welcome. I mean, I think, what was it, 5 years ago, there was a Catholic from the Catholic Church, from the Pope, a note on basically new economics and why it's essential and why it kind of cross cuts all these different issues of poverty and climate. And that was amazing to see. So I think these allies are very welcome. And I think, building on what Joe was saying, I mean, you know, that when we started doing this work, it felt like we assumed that the language would be a really big barrier, that there are like these banners of well-being and donuts and social solidarity and, you know, circularity and whatever. And I think what we saw was that it's not really that way. I mean, these are kind of useful entry points and useful kind of clusters within the field. And I think most people who have been part of the field for a while don't get bogged down in language. You know, it really is about the kind of shared principles. And I mean that sincerely. And I think equally, when we look at the kind of field emerging in Eastern Europe, I think it is not about kind of transplanting language or even the way we describe new economic principles or economic system change to Eastern Europe. It's about kind of following a little bit. It's about kind of giving leaders and organizations in those regions the space to kind of define what economic systems change means in their context, and then supporting that. So I think that embrace of pluralism is a really essential thing.
Yeah, and really want to hone into that kind of the diversity and the pluralism, because there have been accusations, particularly on social media, that this is a Western European construct, and it absolutely isn't, Joe. Right? It's kind of holding the space for different localities and contexts is super important.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I wanted to pick up on something about language, which I think links when you said you like the words connective tissue. And, you know, as a metaphor, that's a very living metaphor. And I just think it's worth sometimes thinking about, like, what language do we use, which reflects what models are we building on? Because when we think about the economy, the traditional way of thinking about it is like a machine, right? Like, we do this, pull this lever, that will happen. And that isn't how our economy works, it isn't how our society works. And so we come from a background of nature funders. We're very inspired by nature. There's a whole field called biomimicry, which is all about taking lessons from nature, and like amazing companies have been set up to, you know, find new solutions that are, you know, basically mimicking what people do in nature, whether it's, you know, dyes or you know, engineering designs that are based on, you know, butterfly wings or whatever. And I think it's true also for how collaboration works, right? You know, ecosystems where there is a kind of symbiotic relationship, not just between two species, but between, you know, multiple species in an area, and that connective tissue that will exist there. So I think sometimes our language really helps us, and also I think it helps connect us, you know, broadly across the world to different traditions. Just having that step of just being a little rooted in our own, you know, in our own, you know, truth as biological beings, right? You know, and actually when these crises are to be considered, it is, you know, clean water, clean air, enough good healthy food. You know, these are the basics of life that everybody wants to secure, and we operate on a plane that often forgets that. And there are unlikely alliances, I think, and coalitions. I mean, there was a report a few weeks ago in the papers about a group of retired military leaders who were arguing that with this big expansion defense spending, that critical, like, renewables infrastructure ought to be able to be counted as critical infrastructure to be able to access some of that spend. And I think that's really interesting, because we know there's massive security impacts of the ecological crises, and actually the people in the military, who are, you know, one part of our society that is very good at long-term planning and futures thinking, they are also a kind of mouthpiece, a set of voices that can reach parts of society with a credibility that, you know, an environmental activist would not have the same reach. So I think that's really interesting. And earlier this week I was speaking to people from the EY New Economy unit, right? I mean, like, EY, the big consulting firm, has a new economy unit. They've produced some really interesting reports. You know, I'd encourage you to go and look them up. Now, admittedly, I think it's 3 people out of a staff of like 400,000. So, you know, they're small, but it was kind of, I was reminded, you know, as they sort of navigate how to be able to, you know, to do ambitious work within the confines of a consulting firm. I often see that in different organizations, you know, whether they are corporates or governments or academic institutions, there are people who get this. There are people who get this on a very deep level. They don't always feel empowered to act on it or talk about it even. But how can we open up the space for people to find each other in that position, and perhaps be, you know, 10% braver than they would otherwise be? Because there is an element of emperor's new clothes going on, right, that a lot of us see there's a problem, and that we don't speak up about it. And I think, can we connect those people in all sorts of institutions, even those unlikely ones?
Yeah, there's actually a really good question connected to what you're saying, Joe, from somebody in the chat called Bonnie. Bonnie says, can you share some examples of accessible language, maybe best campaigns you've seen in this space? Any thoughts?
Yeah. In terms of language, well, I mean, obviously, like the you know, I mean, even I mean, you know, even, you know, Biden. I remember when he would just say, when I hear climate, I think jobs, right? I mean, that I thought was good framing. Obviously, you know, ultimately, you know, it didn't work, but I think it helped get the extra spending through the Inflation Reduction Act. So, like, I think clarity, you know, focusing on clean. I think clean is a really good word. You know, clean air movements have done incredibly well, also combining health, advocates, with environmental advocates, and the word clean gets you places that the word green, does not. Some people will be turned off by green, but everybody wants clean air, everybody wants clean water, and if you're going to have clean water and clean air, it's going to be green. So I think that's another good example. And the other word that I really think has got a lot of power is care. And I think everybody responds to the word care. So I think there's an interesting framing around having an economy that cares, a care economy, which yes covers social care and then the informal care sector, but also just how we treat the environment, how we treat our communities, how we treat inanimate objects that are made, but that we want to look after them because we don't want to waste resources. So I think some of that, like the more everyday language, I think the better, because the word economics certainly turns people off.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually noticed Mamdani also used the word care, and there's a collectivity in the idea of care, right?
Yeah.
Um, there's also another question dedicated to language in the chat. Vivian asks, what language do you use with labor unions, this is very specific, to talk about post-growth economies? Chris, what do you think about that?
I don't know. I think post-growth for kind of a lot of groups is pretty abstract, and I think you have to even understand how growth works to begin with. I think what I would say is that it's much more useful to talk about enduring jobs, really being prepared for whatever comes from artificial intelligence, and really kind of making sure that community wealth and regional purchasing power is kind of circulating as much as possible in the local economy. I think when people stick together, if labor unions make alliances across with the climate movement, with local campaigners, they have much more power. And I think kind of talking about good jobs, really kind of well represented rights and workers' rights, I think that's much more effective when talking to labor unions than kind of post growth, which I think is a very critical concept. And I think it's a really important thing that our economy as a whole move beyond growth as an essential thing, because it's impossible to keep growing. And so it's an important thing to do. But I don't know to what extent a labor union needs to be completely on board with that kind of language or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, they'd still make a unlikely alliance, wouldn't they? I think they were listed in the report.
Yeah, but I think they're absolutely key, and I think their members, they want the essentials of life. They want strong communities, and I think it's part of this really is about identifying. It's a very subconscious assumption that we have that more is better. Yeah, I mean, I've got 3 children, like definitely when it comes to, chocolate or ice cream or whatever, like they would definitely take the view that more is always better. And I would take the view that I'm sure they want more, but there does come a point where they're going to be sick, right? And like, I just try and stop that happening. And I think that's a lesson that we kind of all learn, right? Like, we probably, wouldn't normally sit down and eat like a whole tub of ice cream because we would kind of know there'd be a point where you just became sick. So I think I think maybe sometimes thinking about real growth, right? So it's kind of like, and growth for whom and of what, right? When the argument is we need growth and we're going to do that by massively deregulating the financial sector. Well, you go, well, do you know what? We did try that. There was a big problem in 2008. Did it really make people's lives better? Is that going to work? And so I think it's about like, what is the growth of? Yes, people want to have their needs met, but it's like most people don't actually respond to GDP. It's what that means or what they assume that it means. So I think you need to unpack and get under the skin of that and say, is it real growth? Is this actually increasing the value in our society and our economy? Or is this a bit of a mirage that you've got a nice figure, but you've done that by like sacking half your workforce and loads of people are, then don't have a way of making a living? Like that's not necessarily a helpful growth, is it? And certainly not if you're a labor union.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, we've got 4 minutes left. I can't believe how time has flown on this. I'm gonna pose one question to you both. We spoke about Europe a lot. It appears at least from the outside, that global South narratives about the new economy appear to be minimal. And, capitalism is deeply entrenched in a lot of parts of the world. Will it be a case of the new economy emerging in Europe before the rest, or is that too simplistic, Joe?
I think it is too simplistic. I think there's great work that's happening in so many parts of the world. And I think in many other parts of the world, it's also more intuitive. I remember last year when I was co-editing the special feature for Alliance magazine on the new economy with Crystal Simeoli from the NAWI, the African Macroeconomics Feminist Network. She was just saying how, this stuff for so many people she meets, it's like they just get it. Just people in the street, they just like, they understand when like this economic system has been sort of imposed on their countries. Like it's so obvious to people that it doesn't work. And so I think in Europe there's perhaps more unlearning to do. And there is therefore that need. I think Europe has a heft in the global economy, and I think there is also a lot to work with in terms of an understanding that it isn't entirely about GDP, right? That kind of European way of life, kind of good social protection. You're starting from a positive base there. And there is a lot of interesting work. So I don't think it's about Europe kind of leading the world, but I think work can be interesting and happen in Europe and needs to connect with other parts of the world, learn from other parts of the world, and that exchange, because it will look different in different parts of the world, is what is really exciting.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I don't think you'll be mapping the rest of the world at any point soon, but going back to alliances, I mean, with the global South, how can the new economy of Europe forge these coalitions with other parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot happening in other parts of the world. I think we focus on Europe because of its high material footprint, and it's where a lot of the damaging aspects of our current economic model were refined. And so I think it's an important testing ground, but certainly not the origin or endpoint of economic imagination. I think in the global South, there is a lot of interesting and important work around debt justice, around food sovereignty, community wealth, rights of nature. And in Europe, it's about unwinding overconsumption and exploitative supply chains and this kind of stuff. So I think I would also be wary of a storyline that talks about, Europe getting there first and then exporting a model. I don't see that. I think Europe needs to, shrink its footprint, really kind of repair historical harms and do a genuinely good job listening. I do think there is a really interesting opportunity for Europe to compare to what's happening in the US and maybe how China's operating, to be a genuinely fair trade partner and to really help other economies develop in a way that is good for the world. And so I hope to see that happen. But I think it's not the be all end all of new economics.
There is so much work to do, but so much has been done. Thank you so much to both of you. You should be proud of the paper, and I'm sure we're going to hear more from you. Thank you to all our audience for joining today. Please keep the conversation going on social media. Please find us on there. Thank you to Partners for a New Economy and Metabolic. Thank you, Joe and Chris. Thank you for your time.
Shafi.
See you soon.